Now, before we look into what these different approaches are and how we can use them, we first have to understand the nature of information goods. Information goods are known as, in economic terms, as public goods. This is because they are non-rivalrous in nature and non-excludable in nature. So what do these terms mean? A rivalrous good is one which once used cannot be used again. You can think of rivalrousness in terms of consumption. Therefore, the opposite of a rivalrous good, that is, a non-rivalrous good, in contrast, is never extinguished regardless of how many times it is used. For an example, an apple is a rivalrous good. This is because once someone eats it, no one else is able to eat or consume that apple anymore. In contrast, information or information goods are usually non-rivalrous. That is, for instance, an information good such as a book, the book can be read by someone and then someone else can read it again. The book does not get diminished by the more number of people reading it. Therefore, it is a non-rivalrous good. A perfectly non-rivalrous good, such as pure information rather than an information good, is one which can be used an infinite number of times without any loss to the information. That is, regardless of the amount of consumption of the good, the marginal cost of providing it to another consumer is always zero. Similarly, an excludable good is one whose use can be restricted to only a certain number or only a certain set of people. It can be differentiated from rivalrousness by thinking of excludability as the ability to keep someone out from using it. So, though they sometimes overlap, a good way of understanding the difference in your mind is that a rivalrous good is one which gets diminished with more consumption, while an excludable good is one which does not allow more than a certain number of parties to use it at the same time. So a good example of an excludable good is the light from a lighthouse, since it provides light and hence directions to any and all ships that pass by. It is only restricted by the extent to which the distance that light can travel, and therefore it's almost completely non-excludable. Similarly, private parks or even public parks, roads, they're mostly non-excludable unless there is a separate entry fee or toll tax, which lends it a more excludable nature. Let's move on to slide 6 for some examples to help better understand what excludable, non-excludable, rival, and non-rival means. So if a good is both excludable as well as rival, then it has the nature of a private good. Therefore, an apple, as previously explained, and most day-to-day items around you that you see, they tend to be private goods. So clothes, food, flowers, they're excludable as well as rival. They're excludable because only one person can be using it at one time, and they're rival because when someone consumes them once, this reduces the ability for another party to use them again. Of course, clothes can be used secondhand, so in this example, consider clothes as maybe not such a rival good. It may be placed a little wrong in this graph actually. Next, we look to the block to the right, that is when a good is non-excludable but rival. These are known as common goods, also known as common pool resources, since the typical examples of common goods are natural resources. Since it is non-excludable but rival, this means they tend to be overconsumed or abused easily. Since they're non-excludable but still rival, they're very easily overconsumed or even abused. With no excludability, it is in the rational interest of individuals to consume and gather as much of the good for themselves, as the rivalry factor means that there will be less for them if they do not consume it. This phenomenon gives rise to the term tragedy of the commons, which refers to the problem of depleting limited resources of common goods. Next, we have goods which are excludable but non-rival. These type of goods are commonly made artificially scarce, since it requires a certain membership in order to enjoy the benefits of the good. Some examples of these are listed here: cable TVs, private parks, cinemas, etc. A cable TV, for example, it requires a monthly fee but is non-rival after that payment. And then finally, we have public goods. Public goods are goods which are both non-excludable as well as non-rival. Information and knowledge are common examples of public goods. The other type of examples include air that we breathe, public parks, street lamps, etc. However, the biggest problem with public goods is known as the free rider problem. The characteristics of the public goods determine that they are easily to be consumed without payment. This nature of information as a public good is crucial to how we understand the economics of intellectual property. The public good nature means that there is no loss in quality or quantity when information is used or transferred. Therefore, information is most efficiently used when it is freely and widely consumed. In other words, when we put artificial legal sanctions or legal rights such as intellectual property over information goods, we are actually creating an inefficiency since information is a public good, which means it is most efficiently used if it is given out for free and widely consumed. George Bernard Shaw actually came up with a quote which quite aptly describes the public goods nature of information. The quote is, he starts, "If you have an apple and I have an apple and we exchange these apples, then you and I will still each have only one apple. But if you have an idea and I have an idea and we exchange these ideas, then each of us has two ideas." Let's move on to slide 7, which discusses the incentive theory. The incentive theory starts from the point that information goods are most efficiently used when they are freely and widely consumed. However, it questions that if it is freely and widely consumed, how does the creator of such information goods, or someone who comes up with an idea that helps mankind, for instance, how does such a person recuperate the investments made in creating such an information good? Especially when the idea is easy to copy or easy to reverse engineer and reconstruct. Since the difficult part, that is coming up with the idea or coming up with methods which can implement the idea, has already been put out in the public, anyone else can just copy this and reconstruct it. Therefore, there is very little incentive for the creation of new information. Once the information is created, the ease with which it can be reproduced or reverse engineered proportionately reduces the ability of the creator to recuperate any investments that he or she may have made in the creation of such information. Therefore, in order to create incentives, artificial legal restrictions are implemented. These are intellectual property rights. When this limited right to exclude others from reproducing that information, either in the form of a patent or copyright, for example, the creator or innovator is able to appropriate benefits during that period by monetizing the creation through sales or licensing. This exclusion right therefore acts as an incentive which increases the rate of information. However, as described earlier, information goods, since they have the public goods characteristics, there is an inefficiency created when this exclusion right is granted, since it is no longer being most efficiently used. This initial inefficiency that is created by allowing intellectual property rights and reducing the spread of information is known as a static inefficiency. As the ability to exclude other competitors from the market allows creators to charge a price above the marginal cost, that is, it allows the innovator or the creator to raise the price than they would have in an otherwise free market, it leads to certain consumers who would have bought it at that lower price to now be priced out. Since a lesser number of people are able to make use of the good, this is another inefficiency that is created. This loss is referred to as a deadweight loss. Similarly, other costs that arise include transaction costs, administration costs, and enforcement costs of these intellectual property rights. So together, there is a significant amount of inefficiencies created by allowing these intellectual property rights. So the question now arises, why do we allow them? The static inefficiencies, that is all these inefficiencies I just described, act as an incentive to increase the overall rate of innovation. That is to say, unless they were present, creators or innovators would not be incentivized into coming up with that good in the first place. Thus, the static inefficiency is seen necessary for what is known as dynamic efficiency. A balanced IP regime therefore needs to ensure that the losses from static inefficiencies are much lesser than the gains from dynamic efficiency. Therefore, analysis through this incentive theory lens focuses on the trade-off between static inefficiencies and dynamic efficiency. Or more specifically, it tries to ensure that the dynamic efficiency is greater than the losses from static inefficiency. To give a simplistic example, if the patent duration over any invention was raised to 100 years of a patent monopoly, this would mean that once you create something and patent it, for the next 100 years, you would be able to charge whatever price you want, since no one else would be allowed to copy your patented invention. However, a patent duration of 100 years would mean 100 years of monopoly pricing. This means a great number of people who would have otherwise been able to buy that good at a free market price is now not able to buy that good at this new monopoly pricing. This also means the information is being underused and underutilized. So this static inefficiency is huge. In order to justify such a static inefficiency, you would need to prove that this static inefficiency is required, is necessary to bring the rate of innovation that you desire. If it cannot be proved, there is no reason to have this big a patent period. The same trade-off exists in copyright law. So while patent law is more or less fixed at 20 years across the world now, there is talk of copyright periods being extended in certain countries. In that case, the incentive theory, as described above, would be the kind of consideration policymakers would need to consider. Other types of considerations where the incentive theory comes into play is, say, for example, price discrimination, which is seen as one method of reducing static inefficiencies without having to change the current patent laws as they exist. Price discrimination would allow companies to sell certain products at higher prices in developed countries and lower prices in developing countries. This would mean that more people in developing countries would be able to afford this, while they would still be able to make the profit of developed countries, thereby reducing inefficiencies, static inefficiencies, by allowing more access to more people, and also by increasing the usage of information. Theoretically, perfect price discrimination would allow every consumer to tailor the price to his or her ability to pay. However, this is not possible, of course, in real life. It's not even possible to discover what price people would be willing to pay optimally. A more realistic example would be national price discrimination, as I just described, where, for example, a product could be sold at $100 in a rich country and the same product made available at $15 in a poorer country. Let's move on to slide number 9, the critiques of the incentive theory. So the first major critique which is pointed out is that it only accounts for financial incentives in determining intellectual property policy. It does not include, for instance, other incentives such as prestige or scientific curiosity or lead time advantages in the market. These are all different types of incentives which also push people into making new innovations, into bringing the innovations into the market. And in several fields, including academic publishing, art, software, it can be argued that these incentives are in themselves sufficient to generate innovative activity. There are, of course, other fields, the most prominent example being pharmaceuticals, where non-financial incentives play little to no role, since there's so much money involved simply in coming up and creating that new good. Therefore, from a policy perspective, it would make sense to look into what kind of incentives actually push innovative activity in those specific areas. Therefore, for example, while software patents exist in many countries, softwares rarely have a lifetime of more than, say, 5 years. Therefore, giving a monopoly period of 20 years of patent protection over a software is unnecessarily generating static inefficiencies without generating any dynamic efficiency. If you look into different sectors of technology, it becomes clear that there are different time periods or different breadths of intellectual property which may be more suitable. However, as it currently stands, because of the WTO TRIPS agreement, minimum periods for copyrights and patents are harmonized across the world. However, the same cost-benefit analysis through the incentive theory can be used to justify or to turn down other methods of either strengthening or weakening the IP system or IP regimes as required. As is obvious from this discussion so far, there's also a need to shift away from harmonization across sectors as well as across nations. This will allow nations to calibrate IP regimes to best suit their own individual growth and goals. And finally, the third related criticism is that this incentive theory does not necessitate taking into account distributional concerns. An example of the type of problem that this could create is, take pharmaceutical patents for example. Such a system would equally incentivize the investment of innovative resources into the creation of hair loss remedies as it would into the investment of, say, heart disease. And if it so happens that buyers for hair loss remedies are more willing to pay and more willing and have more money to spend on hair loss remedies than heart disease patients, then this system would incentivize the allocation of inventive resources more into hair loss remedies than heart disease. This is the distributional concern. So with this, we see that there are three main critiques of the incentive theory. That is, it does not take into account non-monetary incentives, it has to go against the trend of harmonization, and it does not take into account distributional concerns. Now we move on to the next slide, slide number 10.